Welcome
Dr.
back to the Live
Ben
Free
Rein.
and Diet Hard
This one's
podcast.
cool.
I'm your host, Andrew
I don't
Coates.
often get
Join me
call
along
you
with
a
industry leaders and
mainstream
friends
author
on a
of
quest
the
to get more people
successful
through the gym
book,
door and
Why
eating and living
Brains
healthier.
Need Friends.
Join me where
I've
evidence meets
recently
empathy
ripped right
while
through it. I think
rejecting
it's
fitness industry
fantastic.
fads and extremism.
And you've got the education
Let's
background,
begin.
PhD in neuroscience, and fantastic social media. You do a great job of communicating neuroscience concepts. Heavy footprint in the fitness industry. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And to also be introduced as a mainstream author is new for me, as this is my first book, just came out very recently. So that's a fun new intro as well. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's true. I mean, no disrespect to anybody self-published. I think a lot of people have done great things, but I mean, this is a major release, and it's written for, coaches are going to love it. You're going to get a lot out of it, but this is written for the everyday person. It is meant for a larger audience. It's going to find a larger audience. I know it will. And it's kind of about stuff that we in the fitness industry, we know that there's a big relation between our social interaction and our long-term health outcomes. So here's a simple low-hanging fruit question. Is loneliness as dangerous as smoking?
It is. And people have heard probably that statistic of where that question comes from. The statistic is being isolated is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That statement, there's a lot going on in that statement, because people might be like, holy shit. First off, well, I'm sorry, I just swore. I don't know if we swear on this podcast. People might say, holy cow.
Fuck yes. Fire away. Okay.
Great.
Everybody will be.
So people are alarmed by that statistic. Obviously smoking has effects on the lungs, which are, being isolated doesn't have effects on the lungs. It's a totally different mechanism. But that statistic comes from looking at pure mortality rates, likelihood of death, period. And there are some really alarming studies looking at really large populations, like hundreds of thousands of people, tracking them over a long period of time, and just looking at how does their social engagement compare with their likelihood of dying by any cause. And in one of the studies that had about 300,000 people, they found that being isolated increased the risk of death by any cause by 50%, which is shocking. And that's kind of where you get your, as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But yeah, it is very bad, genuinely, for a bunch of bodily systems, not just the brain.
In that big cohort of data, is there control for factors like, I would think that people who are, and we'll get into definition around isolation after versus solitude, but would rates of drinking be higher? Would sedentary behavior be higher? Less physical activity? So what's the cause effect loop within all that, if we know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that's well controlled for in those studies, but it is a good point. I think taking those things out of it, there is like well-established data. Of course, I wrote an entire book on it. That would suck if there was not data showing that isolation is bad for us in many ways. And the kind of broad, easy explanation that I'll give here is inflammation. So being chronically isolated is very similar in what it does to the body in terms of being chronically stressed. It's because the body processes isolation as stress. We don't want to be, our bodies don't want us to be alone. And this probably predates our current era. If you think back, millennia ago in an ancient world, being alone is a signal to your brain that, hey, you might die out here. You need to find your tribe. You need to find your community. You're better at hunting, protecting yourselves. And so we have these alarm systems, these alarm bells that start ringing in our brains. And literally being isolated activates the HPA axis, the body's stress response system. And so when people are isolated, their cortisol levels go up, the stress hormone, and they show a stress response in their body. And so when we look at people who, in those studies, let's say, they're chronically isolated, they're spending a lot of time together, they're spending a lot of time alone, not together. And over years, that effect is stacking up. Well, when you have chronically elevated cortisol, you have this chronic activation of the stress response, it can lead to inflammation, chronic inflammation, because through a very complicated mechanism I can explain if you want, but typically cortisol lowers inflammation in short term, because when you're facing some stressor, you need inflammation to go away, you need to be ready to fight. But over the long term, if cortisol remains high, it kind of stops having that effect. And so that one of the body's anti-inflammation systems, cortisol, kind of goes out of service. And so you end up with more inflammation than you would normally have. And then inflammation is bad because, of course, inflammation just in the way is not a good thing when your brain cells are trying to communicate, your heart's trying to pump, your tissues are trying to do whatever they're meant to do.
Mm.
Inflammation is not conducive for the general function of those organs. And so what I think maybe is happening here is that people who are isolated, they have this chronic buildup of inflammation, and then when there's some sort of major insult or major event, like for instance a stroke or a heart attack, something like that, the body's ability to recover from that insult is diminished because there's all this inflammation built up. And so there's actually, there's data, for instance, that people who have strokes who are isolated, they have poorer recovery outcomes. If you have a heart attack and you are discharged from the hospital into a single housing environment where you are, you don't have any roommates, you live alone, those people are twice as likely to die in the next 3 years than those who are discharged into basically a community environment or have roommates or live with their families. And so I think, and even in mice, like in animal studies, looking at this mechanistically, this link has been made that if a mouse is isolated, and yes, mice are social animals, so we can study them similarly, but if a mouse is isolated and they experience a stroke, they will experience a larger stroke, that it's worse. They will have more dead brain cells. And then if they suppress inflammation before that stroke, so you take that, presumably inflammation is happening because they're isolated. You take away that inflammation and then the stroke happens. The stroke is no longer larger. So it kind of mechanistically validates at least this concept that I'm proposing, that the isolation is just kind of setting us off in a way that we're less resilient. And then when something happens, we're more likely to have a really bad outcome. We're more likely to die. We're less likely to recover. And so generally, it's not good for our health. It's setting us back a step.
And I'm pretty comfortable saying this has come up a few different episodes before. Let's say someone has a serious fall and fracture injury, then they are almost certain they're more likely to be more isolated, or certainly have cut off access to the independent social life that they had. And we tend to see the acceleration of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's in those cases. So there are just so many ways that being isolated. And to the original question about it, it's not that there's any attempt to deflect from, well, is isolation in isolation itself this terrible thing for us? But yeah, it's certainly going to contribute to other things that are bad as well. So it's a cocktail of terrible that is killing people to the point where it's actually as bad as smoking, which I think is why that statement holds the gravity it does.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about solitude versus isolation? Because I am someone who lives alone, except for Ozzy, who's just chilling in the chair next to me, my cat. And I like it that way. But of course, as I get older, I do think about these sort of things, right? And there's a lot of people I know who, whether they're purely introverted or they just prefer having their own space, and you're happily in a peaceful place about that. Can you explain the difference between solitude and isolation?
Yeah, as a neuroscientist who's constantly telling people, hey, as a neuroscientist who's constantly telling people interaction is important, isolation is bad for you, I worry about upsetting people who are like what you're talking about, right? They actually don't mind being alone, right? And it's absolutely not the case that if you're an introvert, you enjoy being alone, that going out and socializing every day and making this a focal point of your life is going to make you necessarily healthier, right? That's actually probably not a good thing. When it comes to making the most of your social interactions, it's about kind of getting to what the point is of your comfort level. So if you're really extroverted, you should be having frequent social interactions. If you're really introverted, you should be having just a little bit of interaction, whatever kind of floats your boat. And so when you get to the question of isolation versus like loneliness or solitude, loneliness, because I use the term loneliness in the book. So loneliness is a psychological state, right? I feel lonely because my social needs are not being met. I'm sitting here alone. I'm calling friends. I want to do something. Nobody's around. And it's like, man, this sucks. I'm so lonely. Isolation is not necessarily a psychological state like that where you're craving interaction. Isolation is just the objective state of being alone, and especially being alone for too long, right? Being like isolated. Those things are both not good for you, but there's definitely, as I was at the beginning of my answer, as I was explaining, there's definitely a cutoff where you can be alone, you can be isolated, and it can be totally fine for you. It's not bad for you. Or if it goes on for too long, you can be isolated and it becomes bad for you. And so, an analogy that I like to use is like a plant and a plant that needs to be watered. So everybody needs some level of social interaction. Some plants need more water than others. For introverts, they can go a while without it being watered. They can, hang out at home for a couple of days and experience that solitude without it being a problem. But that soil does need to be watered at some point. For an extrovert, that soil needs to be watered all the time. But the problem really is if we let the soil completely dry out, where it gets to a point where we have not interacted with anybody in a very long time. That's, I think, where the real health consequences start to set in, where our bodies are detecting the absence of social interaction in a way that doesn't feel comfortable. So I think, talking about this idea of, is it okay to sit home alone? Yeah, it is. It's totally fine to sit home alone, as long as you're occasionally getting out and you're not constantly feeling this, like, my social needs are not being met. I wish I could have more interaction in my life.
So what you're saying is introverts are like cacti.
Yeah, that's right.
I know that's totally ridiculous.
In terms of the level of watering, not the presence of spikes.
Maybe some of that too. I know a few introverts who are pretty spiky and prickly. This episode is brought to you by VersaGrips. After my first workout with VersaGrips, I swore I'll never lift without them again. VersaGrips is the premier lifting grip brand, and because my friend Nick Shaw, the co-founder of RP Strength, raves about them, I finally got a pair. I love them. If you're worried that using VersaGrips will interfere with developing grip strength, it won't, and it's silly to limit how much you can lift and how close you can train target muscles like hamstrings or lats to failure because your grip is the limiting factor. I often get asked by my female clients, and I've been recommending VersaGrips long before they became a sponsor. My clients love them. Regular straps suck. They're always too thick or too short. They're annoying to use. Personally, I've never found them effective. Maybe it's just me. VersaGrips are night and day better. They even form a protective layer between your delicate hands and the toughest barbell knurling, so they replace gloves too. VersaGrips are designed with premium non-slip materials, so you never have to worry about your grip slipping. You can just focus on lifting weight. I'll give you two options to grab your pair today. You can check out www.versagrips.com/Andrew Coates, which will automatically apply your discount, or visit the VersaGrips store on Amazon. Use the option that gets you the better deal, easier shipping, but shoot me a message to let me know you grabbed a pair. What about virtual interaction? Is there danger in the growth of virtual interaction where it creates the illusion of connection?
That's a good question. I think generally looking at virtual interaction, it's not as good for us as in person. And I think that the data there lines up quite well with our lived experience, right? That you interact with someone on FaceTime or whatever, you hang up and it's like, that was pretty nice, but I don't feel the same kind of satisfaction that I do if I were to meet them for coffee and face to face. And especially, gosh, you scroll social media for an hour and you comment on a few posts or whatever, and you interact that way. And then you close the app. That does not feel like going to a party, right? Very different. And I think that, and by the way, the data are consistent on that. It suggests that basically the less lifelike an interaction is, so like a text conversation, for instance, is less lifelike than even a video call, which is of course less lifelike than real life. The less lifelike it is, the less joy and enjoyment people get out of the interaction. And the way I look at this from a neuroscience perspective is that when we interact face to face, there are many important social signals that we are processing that tell us this is a human being I'm interacting with, right? The person is making facial expressions. You can hear their tone of voice. You see their body language. There's so many things, so many important signals that goes into our brains, and our brains read those emotions and recognize, okay, this is how they're feeling. It drives empathy, all these important things that constitute a human social interaction. But when you move into a less lifelike engagement, like a video call, for instance, you lose immediately, even though you can still see and hear each other. You lose eye contact, you lose social smells, you lose probably the body language from the lower half of the body, unless you're standing so far back from your computer that you can see your full body for whatever reason. So you're losing some signals, and it would make sense that therefore that would not activate and engage the brain systems that typically guide our social interactions to the same level. And therefore, we may not experience as much joy, because when we do interact, we experience this pleasure because we have these social reward systems in our brain that make us feel good around others.
Mm.
And then so you imagine if you could progressively strip away those cues until you get to the point where you're just in a text message and you don't have any of those cues, you just have the words. You can maybe assume some of the kind of emotional content of the message, but you really can't see it, you can't feel it. That has the lowest level of enjoyment. But to answer your question of is it dangerous, the silver lining here is that the research suggests that even interacting in the least lifelike scenario for like a text message, for instance, is still better than having no interaction at all.
Mm.
So in a world where COVID happens, for instance, and everybody's, sequestered away into their homes and we literally cannot interact, it's a good thing that we had social media and FaceTime and all these things. Because if that happened, the exact same scenario happened, a couple hundred years ago, the consequences probably would have been worse. But in a current world, 2025, where we don't have COVID and there is no actual restriction holding us from interacting, if we choose to use those convenient automated alternatives, we're actually doing ourselves and our biology a disservice. And so that's where I think that the problem occurs, is that we replace interaction way too readily when it's a discount, right? It's not doing the same thing for our brains and bodies.
That makes a ton of sense. I know you reference in the book that even the use of emojis in text can actually have a small positive effect. And I know when I communicate over text, I also tend to send a lot of voice messages. And so this is like the data is backing up something that I've intuitively understood. If someone asks me a question on social media, I'll send a voice message, and I tend to use emojis very liberally, in part because I know the pitfalls of emotion not coming through via text. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And it's a little bit silly to think about that, like emojis are the solution. Because I don't know. I think people often, think of emojis as kind of a silly juvenile thing, right? I also use emojis all the time personally, because it makes sense. Like, just if you think about it, you have a text interaction, there's no social cues. What if you could just add back some facial expressions, right? Or in your case, if you're talking about voice messages, what if you can add back vocal tone? That makes a difference. That engages the brain differently, because we have brain systems built to detect and respond to those signals. And so when we're adding them, and even an emoji, by the way, makes a difference. There are studies showing that the human brain responds similarly to emoji facial expressions as they do to human facial expressions. So if we can trigger a little bit of that activation, I think we can kind of rebuild some of the texture and dimensionality of our virtual interactions. Ideally, we would just get together face to face, but in a world where we cannot, I think that's a better substitute.
Without getting overtly, let's say, political, how much of the problem is the fracturing of our society along tribal lines? And we know this exists. Socio-politically, we know this exists within the fitness industry. Both nutrition gets very tribal. There's certainly some emerging and, quite frankly, nasty tribalism that's happening in the hypertrophy space and strength training and physio. So, yeah, how much of a problem is this?
It's a huge problem, in my opinion. I think if you let's take neuroscience fully out of it. If you ask the average American, has your life been affected in any way by political polarization? I think probably 100% of Americans would say yes, right? We all know somebody who we don't really get along with anymore, maybe because it's hard to get along with them because their political views are so different from ours. And what has happened in the last, decade or so is that when you meet somebody or you're thinking about somebody, we naturally think about traits, right? Like, what is this person like? How does this person identify? And we think about how their identity compares to our identity. That's something the brain does naturally. And there's a term for this idea of self-other overlap, that imagine a Venn diagram. One circle is you, the other circle is the other person, and kind of imagining how much do you have in common? How great is the overlap between those two circles? And so typically in, 20 years ago, whatever, you meet somebody, it's like, oh, well, this person, they work the similar job as me. They live in the same state as me. There's all these different things that typically come top of mind. But recently what happened is political affiliation has come straight to the top of that list, where you really cannot engage with someone nowadays without your brain automatically assessing what is their political affiliation, right? Who did they vote for? I mean, it's possible, but it often comes up because I think politics has seeped into so many different things. And when that political affiliation is different from yours, that self-other overlap shrinks. They pull away from you in a way that's very significant, especially with how, controversial politics has gotten nowadays. Whoops. And something just happened with my with my table. But when that self-other overlap separates, what happens is it actually changes the way our brains engage with that person. It actually turns down the activity in empathy related systems, which means that we basically treat them as less human, right? We do not engage with their emotions as much. We do not, our brains don't work as hard to try to understand and share that person's emotions. And when that happens, when you don't really care as much about what someone else is feeling, it becomes much easier to become combative and to become hostile. And so, I think that really is truly one of the major problems in modern culture is that we're not empathizing with each other as much. And it's actually kind of quite silly because it's, the political system, especially a two-party political system, is really built to take advantage of this, tribalistic tendency in the brain, right? We are naturally very good at identifying that person's in my in-group, that person's not. And if you think about it, it actually does make sense in an ancient world to not care about the person in the out-group because that's your rival tribe, right? If you find a person, think a long time ago, you're in the jungle, you find a person who's been stabbed and they're on the ground bleeding, but then you notice, oh, this person's not from my tribe. I don't give a shit, right? It's actually better for me to not feel anything so I can just leave this person and not risk my life trying to save them. But nowadays, that's completely, we don't live in tribes anymore, right? Except we sort of do because we're all quietly, silently, or sometimes visibly establishing what our in-group and out-group is and basically dividing 50-50 along tribal lines.
I was trying to be very nuanced with this sort of stuff. So my media is explicitly non-political. And I'm very frequently given very positive feedback for that because I think a lot of people get exhausted because it's what they're drowned in. I try to point out to people that what I call socio-political talking heads, it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum they are in it for their own self-gain and their own self-benefit and agenda. They are status-seeking individuals at their absolute essence. They don't care about your well-being, no matter how much they profess to and how much their tribal ideals align with yours. I'll come back to that. They're trying to manipulate you, whether it's manipulate you to be mad about what the other side is doing in this dichotomy or get you wound up involved in whatever they're talking about in a positive way. And then I think it's this Batman Joker sort of dynamic where they share each other back and forth to wind up their own base. And I think a lot of people are easily manipulated and make themselves very vulnerable to it. One of the things that I tend to have boundaries around in my life are people whose their identity is so wrapped up in this stuff that you can tell that by one or two of their beliefs, all of their beliefs, it's like they download and outsource the entire tribal ideology as opposed to have any independent thought for themselves. And where someone like me, who tends to be nuanced issue by issue, and also like I may have thoughtful discussions with people who are close to me who I trust in smaller doses, but for someone on social media to demand my stance on something, you can go kick rocks, like literally fuck right off. No, that's never going to happen. But what happens is if you share one particular point on the spectrum, either A, people will assume you are part of their tribe or the opposing tribe based on one thing, a tribe that I do not identify with. And two, if you share a number of things that are inconsistent, and Chris Williamson does a great job on Modern Wisdom to talk about this, you become an unreliable ally. In theory, you're part of a tribe, but then you differ with them on certain issues. And all of a sudden, it makes sense that you can't be trusted to be a diehard with them when the chips are down. So you're not rewarded. And here's another thought. One of my biggest pet peeves are failed fitness professionals who suddenly become socio-political talking heads. I do not believe these people have your best interests at heart. And I think it hijacks you and your emotional well-being. It takes you off course of, oh, I know what I was going to say. I'm not an expert in geopolitics or these complex things. I am a theoretically, I don't like the word expert, but my expertise is in nutrition, exercise science, and various aspects of the fitness industry. So I think it's ridiculous when fitness professionals in particular seem to always have a loud opinion about, oh God, whatever the hell is going on in the world. And it's like, no, I just don't have to have an opinion about that. And that will bother. There are going to be some people listening to this and demand, no, you need to care about these things. It's not that I don't care. It's just, you're not entitled to all of my real-time thoughts on this stuff. And that's how I preserve my emotional well-being, by not drowning in this crap all the time.
I 100% agree with all the political comments you made, or the comments you made about politics. I guess they weren't political comments, but yeah, like, we've gotten so good at the whole in-group, out-group thing that what you hit is so true. Like, I use this example sometimes. So a lot of people, this happens where they follow a celebrity. Let's say, let's use Taylor Swift. This is a real life example.
Sure.
You follow Taylor Swift. You love her music. You're a big fan. You've seen her in concert. You buy her albums, yada, yada. And then all of a sudden, one day she posts that she's endorsing Kamala Harris for president, right? In that moment, a lot of people, and, by the way, I'm not trying to pick one political side or the other. This is just a real life example.
It's an example. Yep.
A lot of people will say, oh my gosh, screw her. I'm not supporting her music anymore. I'm done with her. I'm unfollowing her on social media. And it's like, why is it that we can love someone's music, agree with everything they do, but then if they don't agree with us politically, which is one small section of our lives, but there's so much else that we can have in common, that is just a slammed shut door. And it's also assuming that, like, basically Taylor Swift's political stance is like identical to like the most far left liberal possible. So we are very good at slamming shut doors at the earliest sign of any distinction between us. But I think in reality, I hope at least, a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, are very moderate politically, and they see things happening on both sides of the political spectrum and think that doesn't make sense. That also doesn't make sense over there. And so I can, it's perfectly sensible to choose one side or the other. And in terms of different policies, right? You can agree with one side on one thing and agree with the other side on the other thing. And I think that's actually another representation of that intense tribalism, that it's like, I want to pick my side and find comfort in that side, and therefore agree with everything on that side. And whenever anybody disagrees with anything from the other side, that person is an other, right? That is not my tribe. That is not my friend. And I actually can, I refuse to even relate to them. And I think that is, in addition to the loss of empathy that plagues a divided society, I think this willy-nilly, happiness with, I'm cutting off this person, I'm cutting off my mom, I'm cutting off my cousin, it doesn't matter who, because they voted for the other person. And that's just obviously not good for a brain, the human brain, that thrives off of connection. We are allowing our social networks to atrophy because of things that really aren't that important. Like, if you look at especially like a mother or a father, right? You cut off your parents because of political differences. Like, you have so much in common. That is such a treasured relationship to have and to hold. And to cut it off for political reasons, it's like, how did we allow politics to supersede familial relation in our like cultural dynamics in terms of importance? That's, I think, where we're really losing a lot of our sense of community as a human race.
A quick break from this episode to shout out RP Strength and the RP Hypertrophy app. I have a big confession. I've never used a coach before. I've always auto-regulated my training for decades. But I've known Dr. Mike Israetel and Nick Shaw, the founders of RP, for years, and I'll get behind anything they create, including years of reading their books, consuming their media, attending their seminars, and having them as guests on the show. And I've been using the RP Hypertrophy app now for several months. And several things have happened. It forced me to make smaller and more gradual but better increases in weight volume across time. Like putting 5-pound plates on each side of a leg press. Like, who does that? Never before. Only 45s. It cut out the junk volume. It made my workouts faster and more efficient. I show up with a plan. I didn't have to think about what to do. I feel more accountable having to log my progress. And I don't skip things because I don't feel like it. If hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to manage your gains and to take the guesswork out of your program. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free, and if you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. I've also got you a $50 US dollar discount, so go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes. That's rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP.
And I know that anytime, I usually avoid these, even adjacency to these topics, but anytime this specter of this stuff raises, I think people tend to go in their own heads, and then they think the fact that we're dancing around politics is the focus, when in fact, God, I hope you guys get the message about the fracturing of relationships and the tribalism of the stuff. That's the real meaning. Take it in your own life and figure it out as it applies to you. What about the introvert extrovert spectrum? Because we know it's not two like rigid categories. It's more of a spectrum, but the health benefits and the doses of the social stuff. You alluded to this earlier, but I'd love to get a bit more granular. Do introverts still benefit by being dragged out in social interactions?
Yes. So it does seem that way, at least from the science. And this is one of those places where I'm an extrovert and I'm speaking about something that a lot of people experience without having lived it, only having read about the science on it. So I hate the idea of talking to an introvert and saying, although your judgment tells you otherwise, interaction does feel good for you. But at least in the literature, and there's a lot of science on this, that is what seems to be true. It's not what you would expect, but having an interaction, having a one-time interaction, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that, does benefit the brain of an introvert. If you are very introverted, even just having a short interaction like that has been shown to enhance mood. The problem is if this continues for an extended period, then those benefits are going to turn into detriments. So, and the opposite actually, or not the opposite, but it's very different when you look at an extrovert. For an extrovert, the sort of optimal dose of social interaction is much higher. And so again, I was alluding to this with the water. So with the watering plants, an extrovert is like a plant that needs a ton of water. You got to water it constantly. The soil dries out quickly. You need to water it again. An introvert is like a plant that only needs watering occasionally. And so, the concept is if you send an introvert and an extrovert on a vacation together for a week, after the first half day, the introvert's going to be like, I feel great. But then when they get home after that whole week, they're going to feel horrible. They're going to feel exhausted, where the extrovert is going to come home feeling recharged, feeling renewed. And so what I really encourage people to do is to identify, where do you stand on the spectrum from introvert to extrovert? Like you said, this is a continuum. There are tests, psychological tests, very simple actually, made for this purpose. I include one in the book. There's a version of it on my website available for download. And it's literally just 20 questions. It's one of if you've ever heard of the big 5 personality tests, one of the 5 traits is extroversion. And so it's just that section pulled out. It's 20 questions. And it's interesting. It's really interesting to take, because it's not just like, you'd think the questions are something like, how much do you talk in social interactions or whatever? How comfortable do you feel? It's a lot more nuanced things that you wouldn't typically expect. Like how, I am assertive in social interactions. Yes or no? Like, I don't mind being a leader. I occasionally will touch people while I'm talking to them, or, if we're laughing, I don't mind reaching out and grabbing them and something like that. And it's what it amounts to is basically a point scale from 20 to 80. And the higher your score is, the more extroverted you are. And the higher that score is, the more extroverted you are. Basically, the higher your optimal dose of social contact is. And so, again, I think for an introvert, for someone who scores really low in this, you can definitely get away with less interaction, but it doesn't mean that zero interaction should be the answer. And I think that's really where the big problem is, because we are very good as humans at recognizing when enough is enough. You go to the party for 6 hours, or you go on vacation for a week, and you get to that point where it's like, good God, I need to be alone. Like, I just can't wait to get home and lay in my bed and just have no one bother me. We all know that feeling. We're good at detecting that. But what we're not good at detecting is the opposite of that, where we've been sitting at home for a couple of days and we're feeling kind of off. And it's like, I don't really feel right, but does Did I not get a good night's sleep? Am I stressed over work? Is it that fight I had with my friend? Like there's a long list of culprits that we go through before we get to the bottom, which is, oh, I haven't interacted with anybody recently. I haven't really had enough interaction. And especially for introverts who are often telling themselves this story of, I don't like interaction at all. That may never come up. And so that's why I say I worry about the soil drying out. If we leave the soil dry for too long, then I think it can become a problem.
Oh, fantastic. I always classically thought of myself as an extrovert as well. I feel I'm growing, not even gradually more introverted as I get older. I also understand that introversion is very context specific too. It's the type of environments you're in. I was at the Olympia in Vegas walking around, seeing tons of people I knew, and I'm like, great, wonderful, this is super fun. But then by the time it was over, I was pretty cooked and done. And yeah, I can be in, a gym, fitness conference, and I am absolutely pure extrovert, edge of the spectrum extrovert. But, and hell, I've worked in nightclubs and definitely spent my time in them. But if I were to just randomly go out to a nightclub right now, especially by myself, that would kick into extreme introversion and I would not want to be there. So again, I think it's very context specific. What about pets? We talked about human-to-human connection. You have a chapter in the book about the role of pets. Can they be just as good for our health as my cat is laying at my feet as people are for contact?
I think so. I mean, just as good, I don't know. Actually, no one's really done that comparison as far as I've seen in the literature, but very similar, definitely. And the reason I included a chapter in the book on the neuroscience of loving a dog is because the way the brain responds to dogs, and there's less science on other animals.
Yes.
But you have to assume like your cat is currently lying up against your foot, like cozying up to you. That's adorable, right? Like that's very dog-like. I hate to sort of use dogs as the standards, but let's be real. Dogs are very friendly. Cats sometimes are not. And other animals too, right? Like, I don't know about like horses or lizards, geckos, right? Like our geckos crawling and cuddling on you. But the point is, dogs especially activate many of the same brain systems as humans do. And so in a book about why brains need friends and, the importance of social connection, dogs do deserve a chapter. Pets really do deserve a chapter so that people can understand, oh, if you are looking to, supplement your social diet and your social experiences and treat your brain to some of those, that nourishment that social interaction provides, dogs are very much a legitimate component of that, because it's actually been shown that when people interact with dogs, not only do they, does it relax them, it like lowers their lowers their blood pressure, lowers their heart rate, all sorts of great things like that. It calms them down, but it also increases levels of oxytocin, the love hormone. It increases endorphins and dopamine levels and all sorts of great things that you would want, that would benefit your health and benefit your mood. And also like long-term, there are studies showing that people who have pets are actually a lower rate of heart disease, things like that. It's really quite astounding that if you think about it, like I just said, being around or hanging out with a dog lowers your heart rate, lowers your blood pressure. You think about the long-term benefits of always having something like that, right? Like imagine if you could take a medication that would lower your heart rate and blood pressure and kind of keep your nervous system calm. Take that every day for 20 years. It's probably going to be good for your health, right? It's going to lower your risk of cardiovascular disease, things like that. That's kind of the benefit of having a dog. You have this sort of ice pack for the nervous system just hanging around at your feet all the time. And I grew up around dogs and still have a dog, and I don't know if I'll ever not have a dog, although I do love cats. I really do. I just now that I have a dog, I can't have a cat because I think the cat would be it would be turned to scraps quite quickly, unfortunately, thanks to my dog.
Yeah, my cat here, Ozzy, he's great. He fits my lifestyle a little bit more. I grew up with dogs. My father is a legend back in Newfoundland for, rescuing dogs, taking care of dogs, that sort of stuff. There's a saying that good people will be reincarnated as one of Khan. My dad's name's Conan. As in Conan the Barbarian, one of his dogs. Again, I know it's hard to study and tease these things out, and I think you already answered saying like the independent benefits, but I presume at least part of the benefit is if you have a dog, you tend to go take them out for more walks. You're getting outside, more sunshine, more fresh air, higher step count. Do you feel like that's a significant driver? Not the only driver, but that's a big part.
I think it's part of it. There actually are studies that have controlled for this a little bit. Because you're right. I mean, it is true. It has been shown that people who have dogs have higher step counts. But there are some studies showing that when one study in particular, they had older people go for a walk either with or without their dog, and basically walking with their dog had like improved signs of cardiovascular output, that it was better for them, that they were actually showing greater signs of health while walking the dog. And they were also showing similar benefits while just kind of sitting around at home with the dog. But yeah, I mean, for sure, like my dog is incredibly energetic, incredibly needy. And I take her for walks, I take her for runs, I do all sorts of things with her. Like, it is definitely a great motivator to engage in a bit more exercise for me.
What about alcohol? Because last couple of years, there's been a massive surge in the messaging and understanding that no amount of alcohol is good for us. And so here's a little bit of a preface. I had Stan Efforting on, and we had a really good conversation about this. But for a very long time, we believed, and there seemed to be broad data that suggested a moderate amount of alcohol seemed to have some health benefits, right? Heavy drinking is definitely very negative, very aggressively negative. But then when you tease it all out, it looks as though the benefits of the social interaction that often comes with cultures that have, Mediterranean diet or Mediterranean culture seems to be rich with this. A lot of wine drinking. And again, people thought it was the red wine, resveratrol, red wine, which led to be kind of, I think, a dead end pretty much. But it seemed that, as I understand the data, the net positive from the social interaction was greater and masked the minor net negative of light to modest drinking. But this is probably more of an opinion piece, because I think that makes a lot of sense. Is there room for social drinking if it helps get people out and get the benefits of the social interaction?
I think so. I think that if the question is basically, is the trade-off worth it to socialize are you willing to accept the risk of a few drinks to experience the benefits of socializing? I think yes. I mean, I think, again, as assuming that you're not going and taking 40 shots of tequila, right? Like, then probably not. But obviously, in an ideal world, that's not the trade-off. But I think for people who have like social anxiety, for instance, that the only way they can feel comfortable interacting is through having a drink or two. I mean, I think that it is worth it, But I will also note, as you heard in the book, that people often use alcohol in social settings because it's anxiolytic. It reduces our anxiety. It actually acts on some of the same brain systems as like anxiety reducing medications. The study showing that every drink of alcohol reduces social anxiety by 4%, which 4% is not that much, but then you think about, you have 5 and that's 20%. That's pretty good. So people use alcohol because it relaxes them. You're on a first date, good God, get a cocktail going, right? But actually, I argue in the book that while it may make us less anxious, it actually makes us less effective interactors, because what happens when we're drunk is our brains become less effective at detecting negative social signals. So, for instance, you had a couple cocktails on that date, let's say, it's moving forward in the night, you go in for the kiss and you detect a clear sign, a facial expression of negative emotion, get away from me, this is definitely a hard rejection on the kiss. Your brain is actually going to show a weaker response to that negative social stimulus, which means that you are probably more likely to basically violate that person's boundaries and do things that are going against their wishes. And similarly, you might go out for drinks with the coworkers and you make a distasteful joke about someone who you work with, and the joke does not land, and they feel, you could tell they're showing with their face that they are insulted, but you just kind of shrug it off because your brain's like, doesn't matter. There's actually studies showing that basically the amygdala shows weaker responses when we are just to negative social information when we're drunk or even tipsy. And so I think that's worth noting, right? We've all actually probably experienced something like that, where you go out drinking and the next morning you're like, oh my God, I cannot believe I said that thing. Like, I can't believe I did that crazy dance move on the dance floor, right? Like, that was pretty wild, even though everyone was frowning. Um, so I think in order to be really effective interactors, we need to be fully engaged in understanding each other's emotions. That's why empathy exists, so that we can understand each other. And while we may not experience as much anxiety, we're not necessarily interacting in a way that's always productive. So, in addition, of course, that is to the negative health effects of just ingesting this alcohol, which is a toxin, a neurotoxin, and so is not good for the brain. Period. So, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on alcohol for sure.
Fantastic answer. The book goes deeper. That's really good. Something, and I've mentioned this, I think, on the podcast before for regular listeners. Something that's been amazing for me is I've recently gotten on to 0% beers, 0% Corona, 0% Guinness. They're actually really good. I'm not traditionally a huge beer drinker, but what it's allowed me to do is to go into social situations with friends where there's some alcohol, and I think compulsion's too strong a word, but maybe it's the ritual. Maybe it's feeling like you are participating in, what I've done for, 30 years when you really think about it socially. And even if it's hard to explain, I feel like I can be part of it and participate. And maybe just having that drink in hand, it's different than drinking a glass of water. So you are having a beer, right? And I've been around some of my friends who probably drink the most. And everybody knew I had 0% beer. There was no like making fun or peer pressure, whatever. But there's also a second order effect here too, is now I'm setting an example and making it safe for other people to explore this, because oftentimes there's a tremendous amount of peer pressure involved with alcohol, right? So I'm really loving this. It's actually unlocked a bit more social interaction for me, where I'd been feeling maybe even a little bit isolated in some places. Social media shows one side of everything, but you put your head down and work, and I have a lot of client interaction in person, but sometimes you feel a little bit socially isolated from your adult friends who have their own lives. So anyway, this has actually been quite a positive for me. So I would recommend anybody who's sort of like teetering on this one, go try it. Go grab a pack of these, and I think you'll be really impressed, and you get to enjoy the experience because I'm very clear now on how even a couple of drinks very negatively affects my sleep, my next day. I work a lot. I no longer am willing to make that trade-off as I get older, and it's harder when you're older.
Yeah. I've tried the Blue Moon alcohol free. It's actually really good. It's kind of like a soda vibe. It's got like a little carbonation injected in there. It's really good. But yeah, what's funny about what you're describing is I can't help but think about that self-other overlap. And when you're hanging out with your friends and there's a group of guys all drinking beers, and then there's you in the corner with a Sprite, that self-other overlap kind of pulls apart just a tad, right? But if you're drinking a beer, even if it's a non-alcoholic beer, it kind of pushes that a little bit closer, right? And I think there's something important about that. Just when you have things in common with people, and when you are sharing this, this common ground, your brain, it's not only comforting because you feel that you have allies, but also it improves the quality of the interaction. And, it's funny because there are even like tiny things that you would never think of, like body language and like bodily position, where if you have a similar stance, so let's say if we're standing and I have my arms crossed and you cross your arms, and then I, fold a leg over the other and you do the same. If you have similar bodily positions in an interaction, you will end up liking each other more. And just little things like that, where if you have something in common with someone, you like them more. And I think when you show up to a party and you're drinking a Pepsi and everyone else is drinking beer, you are like sort of the odd man out, and there's a natural instinct for your brain to worry about, I'm not affiliating with these people. And something as silly as or as small as replacing that Pepsi with a non-alcoholic beer brings you closer in a way that probably increases the quality of the interaction. So, but with that said, I'm also thinking about fast forward 5-10 years. What if we kind of, as a society, move away from alcohol? And then everybody's hanging out drinking non-alcoholic beers, and there's the one guy drinking an alcoholic beer. And then if you flip that situation on its head and ask, how would that person be treated or considered? It's an interesting, just sort of sci-fi world to imagine.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes.
We're definitely seeing societal change. As I understand, the younger generation now, the late teens, early 20-somethings, are very aggressively moving away from alcohol. They drink less. And I watched a video, and it was more on the rise and fall of the craft beer market popularity, right? But there's an argument made. It's like the age group that really, the millennials that really popularized that, they're getting a bit older now, and all of a sudden the recreational drinking, it just hits them harder. It's like, that's actually a interesting argument. So either way, we're definitely seeing a major shift. And I'm really glad to see, I was walking through Costco a few months ago and I saw this case of Corona Zeros. And of course, I have this grand relationship with the movie Fast and the Furious, the entire franchise. I love them. I don't care how silly they get. Keep making. I would watch 20 more of them. I absolutely would take Vin Diesel in a motorized, 80 years old, and motorized, scooter doing this shit. But of course, there's the thing about you can have any beer you want as long as it's a Corona, right? So you develop a sort of weird relationship with it. So now, of course, these Corona Zeros are fantastic. But either way, it's something I've given a lot of thought about. But I realize that I think it's worth talking about a little bit because I'm in a position to normalize it a little bit more. And I think it's, generally speaking, a net good.
Yeah.
Everybody can find you on Instagram at dr.ben.rein. Where else do you want to send people? Obviously, there's the book.
I mean, depends on the interest. I mean, my website, which is just my name, Ben Rein, Rein, has everything on there. You can contact me. You can download my papers if you're interested in that. My scientific papers. I mean, there's information about all sorts of stuff on there. So pretty much anything you need would be there, including links to all my social media channels.
Guys, go get the book, please. Right? It's fantastic. Like I said, I ripped through it. It's really interesting. It's full of great stories. It is definitely accessible to everyday person. It's not complex, impenetrable neuroscience. It is written for all reading levels. Why brains need friends. I tend to rip through audiobooks. Go pick up a physical copy. I'm sure Amazon or your local bookstore. And please go follow Ben. There's so much depth we can't even touch. The very last thing you were talking about, you were mentioning about mirroring. You go into a bit of depth and the nuance on like mirroring and about how you probably shouldn't worry too much. Oh, there's your dog right there.
There she is.
Mirroring to the point where you're getting hyper fixated on trying to do it, just relax and what have you. But you do explain it a fair bit. So the book does a wonderful job of going far deeper than we can in just a short episode. But I appreciate you coming on, taking the time. I know you've been on a big podcast tour and there's a lot of work involved in releasing a book. So guys, go support. It's a great one. Please. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.